Singapore is a hub for attracting incredible capital and some of the world's best talent. All failure comes down to whether you have the right founder and if that founder has put together the right co-founder team. We just want to back great people and building great businesses. You're just not going to do it in a week. But if you aim to do it in 10 years, there's a possibility you can do it.
Today I'm joined by Magnus. Magnus was the co-founder of Zalora, one of Singapore and Southeast Asia's biggest e-commerce firms. Magnus subsequently founded Antler, the world's first and largest day zero investor. As of today, Antler has over 1,400 portfolio companies and a combined portfolio value of $5 billion. They have offices in 27 cities across 6 continents, including London, Berlin, Stockholm, Singapore, Jakarta, and Sydney. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. I wanted to ask you, when you first started Zalora in 2012, what was the market failure that you were trying to address back then?
If you looked at the general state of the e-commerce market in Southeast Asia at the time, it was less developed than when I was in college a decade earlier, right? So, in the early 2000s in the US, you could order almost anything online. It would arrive in a few days. You know exactly when it arrived. You know exactly what you would pay. And you know exactly the quality of the product. So you had access, you had price, you had the customer experience that was great. You go back to 2012 in the region, most of the stuff that you want to order would either be shipped in from Japan or Korea or China or Europe. For example, if you want to buy fashion, I think the biggest seller of the more premium brands into Southeast Asia was kind of ASOS out of the UK, right? So let's say you were a customer in Indonesia and you would order something. You wouldn't really know whether it would get stopped in customs or not. And if it did get stuck in customs, you didn't really know how much you would pay. So you didn't know whether it would arrive. You didn't know when it would arrive. You wouldn't know what the final price would be. Certain type of products, they weren't allowed to kind of sell into the region. So you had really all these things that you need to deliver really great customer experience with an e-commerce company that just didn't exist. So we were very excited about that opportunity because you're in the region, depending on kind of how you define the wider region, right? Like, our target market was 700 to 800 million people, fastest digitalization the world has ever seen. It's like very exciting to look at the digitalization of the Southeast Asian markets versus the European markets, right? It's like in many it started a bit later, but then literally in a matter of a few years, it just overtook a bunch of the European countries in terms of the amount of people who were online and the amount of e-commerce that was done in the online space. So we got very excited about that. Here you have 700 to 800 million people who don't have a real customer experience of e-commerce. That there's a lot of great products out there that can be accessed. And, I think those are the major shifts you see in technologies. Like you just discover these opportunities where clearly something would happen. It's just a matter of time. And then it comes down to less business model risk and more about executional risk.
It's interesting that when we look back at 2012, the period of like maybe the past decade, there was a lot of push towards trying to integrate the region better through digitization, through e-commerce even. But what were kind of the lessons that you abstracted away that you felt that, there is another solution that's needed for the region, but this time in terms of the startups, in terms of funding startups?
A few of them are around kind of how in general you just build a business, right? A few of them are how they build a very successful business in Southeast Asia. And then obviously there's like a general learnings about the type of people who build companies, which is what we're doing with Antler now. So we look at bucket one. Some of the mistakes we made in the early day was for example, we put a lot of money into building a brand and doing a lot of marketing. We did like a massive pan Southeast Asian TV campaign and other things. Before our product was quite there, right? So when you build an e-commerce company, unless you have really good products on that side and a customer experience that is seamless, if you present that value proposition to a ton of customers, if they come on board and they try it, they're just going to be disappointed, and it's very hard to get them back again, right? So, product first, and then let the product lead the marketing, right? And then when the product is great, you should always be slightly ahead with the product than you are in terms of the brand that you're trying to create. Then you'll save a lot of money in terms of building a business. So that's number one. Number two is figure out like the structural weaknesses early where you can build a real competitive edge, right? So for example, one of the things in Southeast Asia was very interesting in the early days of e-commerce here is the number one payment method. What do you think number one payment method was like back in the early days?
I think back in the early days was primarily cash.
Yeah, well, I mean, you couldn't even do cash, right? So you couldn't do, perhaps in Singapore you could, but in Indonesia, there wasn't a logistics network that was set up to really handle cash, right? So the way most e-commerce companies operated is through something called bank transfer, right? So literally you would go on the website, you'd buy something, you'd check out, you'd get a code, and then you go to a local bank or a retailer and you'd pay. Then you get a code back, you go back to your computer and you finish the checkout, which is a horrible customer experience. Like anyone who build a company, they know that whatever additional friction you put into the process of making a sale will lead to a bunch of cancellations and abandoned carts. And so, for example, Amazon's one-click process is very famous, right? You can literally look at a product, you click one time, you bought it.
Yeah.
And they literally removed all the barriers. Most e-commerce companies, you need to click 5 or 6 or 7 times to do a checkout. In the early days of e-commerce here in the region, you actually had to spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours checking out, right? Because you had to physically go somewhere else and pay.
Yeah.
So when you identify these types of barriers and you solve them, then suddenly you have a competitive edge that nobody else has. Now, obviously, the solution to that now is all of the wallets that you have, GoPay, GrabPay, and so on. But that was a little bit further ahead. We actually launched cash on delivery, as you said, like pan Southeast Asia, where people could just pay our delivery man with cash. So suddenly then you open up a much bigger market. People could just go and buy whatever they wanted, and then they actually just had to pay when it came. But then you create another problem, right? How do you get the cash back? Because you have tens of millions of packagers all across the region, tens of thousands of delivery people, and then a lot of money floating around.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And then you solve that through technology. So basically, you integrate technology with logistics providers so that they can recognize the sale when they get the cash, and then they can pay you, and then they become responsible for the cash and not you, right? So there's a lot of these types of things that you work on putting in place. And I think most great startups have found a way to resolve a barrier like this one.
Yeah.
Because obviously when Grab got started, it was evident that would be a tremendous business model for the region. Or it was quickly evident, and a lot of competitors popped up everywhere. But a few people win, and they are the ones who typically tend to be the best at resolving these types of issues that make the customer experience much, much better. Or for some places, also with e-commerce, the sellers themselves, if the sellers have a better experience on your site, you get more of them. So we kind of looked at these things, we made some mistakes, and we quickly resolved them. We went from, I think, in the beginning we had 4 competitors, and then we had year 2, I think we had 134 competitors. And then slowly you get less and less competitors, or the competitors becomes much smaller, and you kind of resolve more of these issues than anyone else, and then you become the dominating player. So I think that's kind of number 1. And then just quickly on 2 is like, you learn a lot about how to operate across Southeast Asia, right? And Southeast Asia is amazing. If you use the strength of all the countries in the region to your advantage, it's amazing. If you don't, then you're dealing with very different countries with very different cultures, different regulation, and it becomes an issue, right? Instead of being a strength. But if you use it as a strength, it's incredible, right? So we, for example, build an insane tech team in Vietnam, where you have incredible computer scientists who build amazing products, and the cost versus quality is incredible, right? You can go to the Philippines. You want to do any type of back office task, business processing. We have this incredible talent there. They built a whole industry around doing this at the cost and quality, which is better than anyone else. Even a lot of people there speak English better than most Europeans, right? And it's like incredible opportunity. You go to Malaysia, you can hire incredible expertise within many, many areas. Obviously, Singapore is a hub for attracting incredible capital and some of the world's best talent. Indonesia, it's going to be one of the world's largest markets, right? So if you use the whole region as strength, and then you build your company around that, instead of kind of facing all these different challenges, you still have those, of course, but you use the region for your advantage. And I think that's why you see, go to Europe, the biggest e-commerce companies in Europe, American companies. You go to Europe, the biggest last mile delivery companies and last mile, sort of like Grab and Gojek, they're American companies. In Southeast Asia, they're home build companies, right? Like the Chinese and Americans did not win e-commerce in Southeast Asia. They did not win the mobility space. They did not win the payment space. And I think that's because when companies figure out how to use the region in the best possible way, and the various cultures and the access to talent there in the best possible way, and then know how to operate across these different cultures, you'll just win against anyone else who kind of try to come in there and just do it the exact same way as they did in their home market.
Yeah. The interesting thing about Southeast Asia as a fragmented market is that whoever can integrate them best wins, right? In that sense, because if you're from a big market, you're used to thinking about it in the big market, so you kind of assume that the economies of scale that you're used to could easily be replicated. Whereas if you're a small market and you understand reality as a bunch of fragmented markets, you probably have to piece them together and figure out how do you exploit the various comparative advantages.
Yeah, exactly.
The true line across those three lessons, the first one being your product leading marketing, the second one being the ability to identify and solve structural problems, and the third one being to exploit the region's different capabilities. At the core of it is the talent question, because I believe that across the board, maybe all startups companies all kind of know that in the abstract, but when it comes to implementing it, that's where the devil's in the details. So now you moved on to try to solve that talent question. The next question I have is, why does then day zero investing, from your perspective as a company, seem to be the maybe optimal or best solution to assemble talent?
The entire value chain is always important, right? So you can do incredibly well as an investor at any stage, really. It just becomes about different things. So let's say if you're a public market investor or you're a private equity investor, you look at the business much more as a business, right? The people of the business is still insanely important. It's one of the metrics you look at, but you also look at a lot of the unit economics and the growth rate and how does the P&L look like and so on. And the earlier you go in the ecosystem, so the earlier you invest, the more it becomes about the people. Right? To a certain extent, it's always about the people, but the earlier you go, the more important that becomes. Because if you look at how, if you look at why startups fail, right? The number one reason is always the founders, or so founder breakup, but also the right founders. The second reason is they've never got product market fit. Third reason is they couldn't raise capital. The fourth reason is they couldn't get their first customer. And you kind of go down this entire list and you realize that every other reason but the first one is in the end the decision and the outcome of who the first people were, right? Like, so the founders decide what they're going to build. The founders are the one who raise capital. The founders get the first customers. In the end, like in the early days, all failure comes down to whether you have the right founder and if that founder has put together the right co-founder team. So the earlier you go, that should be the kind of really the number one thing you're looking for. And unless you have that, doesn't really matter if you have the best idea in the world or if you have insane access to capital. If you're not the right team, you're not going to win. And you've seen this again and again and again and again. So, and we were quite lucky in the Zalora days to work with a lot of people like that, right? So, Nadim and Kevin, who built Gojek, used to work in Zalora. Chris Fengen built Shopee, used to work in Zalora. Mikael Ferrari built Stashaway. The Shopback crew, Local, Aura, like a ton of really great companies in the region has just been built by Zalora people. And I think it's because we kind of created that environment in Zalora where great people came and you learn a lot. And then you use that to go on to build your next great thing. And that happens everywhere. Like the PayPal mafia in the US is obviously pretty famous with Tesla, LinkedIn, SpaceX, Palantir, lots of great companies coming out of like one. And we saw that at a bit smaller scale, but still a pretty big scale in Zalora. And in Antler, we got excited about, okay, hey, let's identify these people and let's really kind of work with them as early as possible to build insanely great companies around solving very important problems. And since then, we've scaled globally. Now we're in 30 locations. We look at about 160,000 founders a year. We work with 3,000-4,000 founders a year. We helped build 410 new companies last year.
Yeah.
I think we're the most selective investor in the world. We're the most active investor in the world. We're also the most active AI investor in the world.
Yeah.
But it all comes down to this one thing is, have we found an exceptional founder?
Yeah. The follow-on question would then be, why do you put the founders together as opposed to maybe the YC model, which is that people come and apply and they're already pre-selected group of founders? Why is your approach in terms of combining founders your preferred model?
So it's not necessarily preferred. It's just, so sometimes we'll find the team is already established and they already have a company going. Sometimes there's like two people who know each other who's been working together on something for a long time. Let's say you and I were working in Grab, and in the weekends and the evenings we were tinkering around with these very exciting things that we could do together. And then we decided, hey, now we're going to quit and we're going to start build this company. That's an interesting time for us to start talking. And sometimes it's an individual who is on that path. So we're a little bit agnostic to whether it's already a team or a company, or whether it's a couple of people who've been working with on something for a while, or someone who's been very excited about doing something for a while. We just want to ensure that they as individuals are exceptional founder material, right? And then we like to come in as early as possible, right? So sometimes we don't find them, we don't see them until a little bit later, and then we just invest when we have the opportunity to. Like we can invest all the way to Series C. So there's a great example. We just found this team in Korea not too long ago. There was just an announcement around them called Written. It's the fastest growing company out of Korea ever. They're a layer on top of all AI models. So literally they're linked into Anthropic, Gemini, OpenAI. And then they have a layer on top that customizes to the Korean culture and the Korean language. And they're doing the same now for Japan. And that's an example of where they already had a company and they came in. We just came in as early as possible. And literally within 6 months, they now just announced that there's $60 million round. Sometimes like that, or sometimes it's another example is this guy, they built a company called Airlo, which was built out of Singapore. It was a great founder called Badir. He'd built this scratch card business before for calling, long distance calling or calling internationally, which just got killed by WhatsApp and so on. And he was like, hey, I want to build something within the same space, but I want it to be technology enabled. And then we worked with him. And then he built Airlaw, which is obviously now the world's largest eSIM marketplace. And Probably worth, he hasn't done a round in a few years, but probably worth a few $1 billion right now.
Mm-hmm.
So, we just want to come in as early as possible and back incredible people. You might already have a company.
Yeah.
You might already have 1 or 2 team members. It might just be you. We just want to back great people and building great businesses.
What are then the ingredients of the great people that you're looking at?
I think it's very interesting because historically, a lot of people have tried to do a lot of research into this, right? And I think traditionally a lot of us has been focused on kind of where do people go to school or what company they're working before and so on, right? Like in our experience, having done this now and more or less, making it our only focus for the last, what's been 7+ years now, and looking at more than 500,000 founders, looking at all the publicly available data, backing 1,500 portfolio companies. It really, in our opinion, comes down to 3 things. All right. Number 1 is you need a spike. Right. So you need to be better at most other people at something. Right. So obviously, we've gotten to know each other a little bit right now, but you're obviously very good with people. You're good at getting great insights out of people. You're good at identifying trends, and you're probably better at that than most other people. Right. You might have other spikes as well. But if you go into and look at the people who really achieve great things, they tend to have something that they're just better at than most other people. They don't need to be great at everything. Right?
Yeah.
Like look at take Elon Musk, right? He's probably the most successful founder in the world, right? But he clearly has some areas where he has some weaknesses, right? So and in most founders, you really see that, but you can identify something that you're just better at than most of the people. So that's 1, spike. 2, grit. So a lot of people, they start a company, they're onto something really good, and then they hit some wall and they give up, right? I think actually the vast majority of startup failures just comes down to the team giving up, not because they couldn't have got there in the end. And any great startup in the world will get to that point where it seems like it just won't work. Like in early days of Zalora, we had this bank transfer payment method. It was hard to get brands on our website. The customer experience was not all that great. We had very high customer acquisition costs. The product was not quite there. Delivery method was not there. Things were looking really dire. And you're kind of on this fast train moving towards the wall. And unless you manage to move the wall, you run out of money and you fail, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people just give up. And often it's not the best team that wins, but it's the team who just didn't give up, right? So we're looking for that grittiness in the founder. We're looking at, is this a person that if I give you capital and you work on this idea, are you going to give it everything? Are you really going to push it to the limit or you give up? So that's number 2. And number 3 is drive. Drive sometimes I think is confused with passion. So I think passion is important. Passion is great. Passion can really drive people forward. But I have a lot of passionate friends and never get anything done. Right? You probably do this. Like I have friends who've been talking about the specific problem they're excited about for 20 years and they'll never do anything about it. Drive is more this kind of raw ambition combined with the ability to execute, right? Like, can you move things forward, right? So, like, podcast is a great example. Like, I probably know hundreds of people who said, I'm going to set up a podcast. And then they do like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 episodes. And then you never hear about it again. To really make podcasts or any type of new media successful, you really need to go at it for a while, right? And the difference between kind of passion and drive is you set this kind of very high target in terms of what you want to achieve, and then you kind of execute on it and then move it forward, right? Instead of just going around everywhere and talking about things. So in founders, we see those three things very clearly, like grit, not giving up, drive, ambition, and ability to execute. And you see this spike, right? And if you find those three things, it's super exciting.
Mm.
And the good thing is, sure, I guess some people are kind of born with great strengths and some people are born with more drive than others. But I really think that you can work on all of those three, right? You can work on mental resilience and grit. You can work on your drive. And you can work on developing. Most people are just kind of, I think everyone in the world is just kind of pretty good at something. And then if you use that spike and leverage it, you just become better and better at it. And then leverage that into solving an important problem and doing something great. You can really make an incredible difference. So the great thing is you're not really born with any of them, right? So if you don't feel you have them now and you want to build something in the future, look at, okay, how can I really kind of move forward on those three or next few years?
Yeah. Spike, grit, and drive. Yeah, those are the common characteristics of even some of the folks that I've interviewed. They highlight that there is this almost illogical obsession that you need to have, that you must be able to kind of look past social signals, or when other people would stop, you would have to continue.
Yeah.
Good example that I remember or recall was from Professor John Van Wy. He's the world's leading and foremost expert on Charles Darwin. So he was talking about Charles Darwin, and he was saying that when Charles Darwin was a young man, he was actually in med school, and the track back then in England was either you become a clergy, you join or become a pastor, or you become a doctor.
Yeah.
And he was obsessed with just collecting bucks.
Yeah.
And he had this obsession of like collecting bucks. So like there was a story where he had 3 bucks that he saw. He caught 2 with his hand, and because he wanted to collect the third one, he put it in his mouth. And the buck spit an acid and burned his tongue. So he had to spit the buck out, and he recollected that in his autobiography like 30-40 years from then, recounting how he regretted not catching that buck. So it's an interesting kind of like parallel to what you're saying, that you can't have this logical thinking in everything you do. You kind of have to develop a competency, but you have to really follow through with it rather than just give up when times get hard. The question I have for you is then, how do you screen for these kind of criteria in that onboarding process? Because you're filtering from hundreds of thousands of people down to your final 3,000. How do you actually, what are things you look out for?
Yeah, I'll get to it, but I just thought it's interesting what you're talking about, because I just saw you on your website. You did this session on Lee Kuan Yew's book, The Hard Truths. And Lee Kuan Yew obviously is evidently one of those types of people, right? Like clear spikes, ton of drive, ton of grit, right? It's like Singapore in itself is almost like a startup story, right? Like it's bringing together incredible people from very different cultures and building this insanely great hub. It's one of the most remarkable stories in the world, right? So sometimes you can see it in that individuals pretty quickly, right? And sometimes you need to go a little bit deeper. And with founders, it's important to go deep because some of the very best people are introverts, right? And if you're more an extrovert, it's actually easier to get to the spike. It's easier to kind of see where the drive is. It's easier to see where the grit is. But sometimes, the Mark Zuckerberg or in the room will kind of sit a little bit in the back and not partake so much in the conversation. And then what you do then is just kind of look at what they've been doing, look at some of the products they've been building, try to kind of identify where is their spike. Sometimes on grit, you can see from the CV, right? So like, let's say I came here and asked for $1 million investment. And then you looked at my CV and you seen, okay, I built 8 failed startups the last 3 years. Or perhaps I went from this job to that job, to this job, to this job, to that job. And I spent like 3 to 6 months on every single thing. You would be pretty certain that if you gave me $1 million, there's a reasonably big chance that 3 to 6 months from now, I decided to do something else, right? So, on the grittiness, you really look at those transitions, and when people have try to do something and they decide to do something else, what actually happened there. Sometimes it's for the right reason, right? Like, I'm not saying people shouldn't change jobs. I'm not also saying that people shouldn't fail. A lot of the best founders in the world have failed at some point in time. But what happened at that point, right? Like when you built the company, and you decided, hey, this is not going to work. What's the effort that was put in before coming to that decision? What's the milestones you hit, right? And you're really trying to learn about, is this a person that if you back them into solving this very hard problem with your hard-earned capital, or the capital that in our case we manage for other LPs, this person is going to give everything to really make it a success. So a lot of this happens through a personal interaction. Obviously, we are in a situation where we look at kind of thousands of people every year, so we can't meet everyone in person. So typically what we do is we combine a self-assessment and what people have done in their application with just outbound headhunting, referrals from great people, and then we choose a selection of those that we meet in person. We really try to go deep on those 3 areas along the lines of what I was just talking about. So it's a combination of kind of looking at at large data sets and combining it with in-person interactions. And then at some point in time, you kind of really feel it, right? You feel like, okay, here's a spike we're excited about. Here is, you can see the real drive. And we know that if we back this person, they're just not going to give up. And when you feel that, I think any early stage investor, when you really feel that, you get very, very excited about backing them. And you want to back them until, they're insanely successful. And that's what we're trying to do with Antler as well. Like, so if we back in round 1, we want to back in round 2, we want to back in round 3, we want to back in round 4 or 5. We want to put hundreds of millions of dollars into your company. But we want to be there from the early start, and that's how we create an edge later.
Yeah, it's almost counterintuitive because I have friends in the financial world. They literally look at the opposite, right? What are the numbers? They look at the hard numbers, whereas for you, it's really trying to get a qualitative sense of the persons who are really building the companies at the start.
Yeah. And as an investor, you can earn a lot of money either way, right?
Yeah.
You can obviously now there's algorithms and computers who do most of public market trading.
Yeah.
Right? It's pure numbers. They never talk to an individual.
Yeah.
Or you can go all the way, and the further you go towards VR, the more the individual matters.
Yep. Then the question would be, you're building that talent stack at the founder level. You also need a talent stack at the different partners across the different regions. I'm very curious to know how you actually assembled your founding cohort of partners to help build Antler when you were starting out.
So it's interesting how different companies scale. So in Zalora, if you're building an e-commerce platform, you need to obtain scale quickly, right? And so we, for example, we just really need to hire a lot of people really quickly in Zalora, because it's the only way you can make the machinery work. And you can't have a warehouse with no people in them. So you literally just go and kind of trying to find the best possible person, and then you hire them. And then if it doesn't really work out, you need to make a replacement and so on. So I think in certain industries, you don't really have a choice. You just got to hire. When it comes to Antler, ultimately, we need people who are very strong partners to the very best founders in the ecosystem they operate in, right? Like, we cannot just hire anyone in Korea, let's say, and think that person will have access to the very best founders. We really need to find someone who we know can attract the best people, can assess the best people, and be a good partner to the best founders as they're growing and scaling their business. So the way we go about it is very much, first of all, it needs to be a location that we're excited about. Like, so the ecosystem needs to be big enough for us to find great founders and work with them from day zero. And then we need to find the first partner and the second partner that can lead that location, who would be a great partner to the very best founders. So the way we've gone about it is, let's take India as an example. we wanted to launch India back in 2018. Just we're getting started. We started looking for partners, and I think we talked to like 148 candidates or so. And we spent a lot of time with a lot of them. And only when we got to the 148th one, we'd found our fit, which is a guy called Rajiv Sistra. He built Urban Ladder, which is one of the most successful tech companies out of India, which sold to Reliance Industries. And you just know, okay, this person, A, has a great founding experience, A, is great with people, B, is great with people, C, he could really have a good feeling in terms of assessing founder talent. The best founders in India would want to work with him. And then okay, now we're going to have an amazing India operation. And we've gone about, like we just hired a partner, it's not public yet, to run our San Francisco office. And it's the same thing. It's like, for years we've been talking to people, and then finally find this individual that has built a couple of amazing companies, been doing some amazing early stage investments in the region. And it just comes from talking to hundreds and hundreds of people all across the globe. But once you have the fit, have the fit. And then they will attract the very best people there and assess the very best people there. So that's how you grow a company like Antler, where you need the quality of all of your locations to be better than the original node, right? So preferably all the people who run Antler across the globe are better than me. And, so that's what we try to achieve. And I think there are certain businesses like that, right? Like consultancies is another example, like McKinsey, BCG, Bain, and so on. Like you cannot have, the headquarters of McKinsey is in New York. You cannot have the New York team be much more senior and much more better than the rest of the world. You need the person who runs Singapore to preferably be better and more senior than whoever is sitting in there, because they're serving the biggest companies in Southeast Asia, right? So with Antler is very much the same. So that's how you grow these types of businesses. Well, a lot of people have tried to grow this type of business in a more hierarchical way. It never works. You need to grow it in as non-hierarchical way as possible, where each node is stronger than the original, and through that you improve the whole.
That's almost a counterintuitive take to how most people think of businesses, especially in our part of the world where everyone thinks of the hierarchy. What inspired that thinking for you?
Well, I think certain businesses you're better off with a hierarchy, right? So like, for example, I was in the Norwegian Special Forces, and somebody needs to give the command, right? Like you need fast decision making, you need to move quickly. E-commerce is similar. You actually need a hierarchical ecosystem. For this type of business, it would never succeed, because if I hire someone to, let's say, lead Asia, and then that person is slightly junior to me, and then that person hires someone to lead Korea, and then that person hires someone to do the founder scouting, then you just end up with the person who's actually talking to the best founders in the world being 4 layers more junior and less experienced than you originally were, right? Then it just doesn't work. In the same way as these consultancies, is like, if you're the CEO of TSMC, the big chip manufacturer out of Taiwan, or Sony in Japan, like, the person you interact with, you want that person to be equally good or better than the managing partner of McKinsey, who technically is headquartered in New York, right? It's just, there's just no other way to do it. Some people have tried to do it a hierarchical way, right? And it just doesn't work. So it's a long answer to your question, but it's kind of evident from what you're trying to build.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important as a founder, or if you're a CEO of a company, or if you're trying to become a leader. Like, think about the industry you're in and how you best organize your team towards executing on that. Right? Like, if you're at D-Day in Normandy, and you have 500,000 soldiers who needs to storm a beach, right? Like, you better have an hierarchical structure, right? Like, but if you're trying to find the very best founders in the world, and be close to the ecosystem and attract them where you are, you need to ensure that that person is equally or better than you, and you need to create a structure around it that works.
Yeah. You've built this network, such an impressive network across the globe. Like I read that you even have one in Nairobi.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
We're just setting up Lagos as well in Nigeria. We'll have 2 Africa offices now.
Yeah, it's insane, the spread. I don't think I've seen something as comprehensive in terms of geographical coverage, in terms of a investing firm at such an early stage. But you still continue to base yourself in Singapore primarily. What makes Singapore like the pool for you?
So I think what you're saying is interesting. So I think most people don't know this, but Antler 8 years ago, we had like a 2-person office on Cecil Street. And we built this whole thing out of here. And I think we, by far, we are the most active VC in the world now. And so on certain metrics, we are kind of one of the biggest VCs in the world now. And we built it out of Singapore and did it globally, which I think is quite different from most other VCs. So historically, most of the biggest VCs have either come from the US to the rest of the world, or in certain instances, they come from China to the rest of the world. And we are kind of the only one who's really kind of built out of Southeast Asia to the rest of the world, but also probably anywhere outside of the US and China. And we were very excited about that opportunity because I had been in this ecosystem since the early days, right? So when in 2012, sure, there were some great tech companies here, Eraser, for example. But I think in 2012, in the entire Southeast Asia region, $200 million a year was put into venture. Fast forward to 2022, I think it was 33 billion. And I'd lived through a lot of that growth. So we have access to all this tremendous talent and all the ecosystem players there. And so instead of kind of moving to London or moving to San Francisco, where A, you're not in an economy that is growing 6 to 8% per year. B, you don't have that same ecosystem access. C, obviously, what we are doing is quite new in terms of a model, and you benefit from being close to the government, and you can do that in a way in Singapore that you can't do anywhere else. It just became like the natural place to launch. We did consider launching it in all the major ecosystems in the world and set up the HQ there and just move there, but decided that Singapore was just the best fit because of those 3 reasons. And it's been amazing, right? Now obviously we're truly global, but the company is still based here and the headquarters is still here, and it's just a great place to live.
Where do you think Singapore and the region's comparative advantages lie in now?
So it's layered, right? So let's take layer 1, Singapore only, right? So I think in Singapore only, just talking about that first, I think the biggest companies being built out of Singapore going forward are going to be true global companies, right? So I think there was a way where the biggest companies, tech companies in Southeast Asia, were built for Southeast Asia, but not really for the world. But that's happening now. Like if you look at the biggest successes of the founders we backed out of Singapore, like Aerolo I spoke about earlier, they're truly global companies. And a lot of companies have shown that they can win against the rest of the world from tiny places, like Spotify. What Stockholm is 800,000 million people, and they won against Apple on their core entertainment segment, music. Atlassian out of Sydney won against Microsoft and productivity software. Aerolo out of Singapore won against the biggest telcos and Google on the eSIM marketplace, right? So you can really build these incredible global businesses out of anywhere. And Singapore is one of those places where I think for the next decade, that's going to be the biggest opportunity. So that's kind of layer 1. Then layer 2 is if you think about the region overall, the dynamics is such that if you look at all types of macroeconomic data, we're in the only region which is consistently grown 68% per year. Sure, there are issues and some places horrible issues that needs to be dealt with, like in Myanmar, and there's been overthrown of governments here and there. Like, there's eccentric leaders and so on, but like throughout that whole thing, you have a region which is very stably growing, with a middle class that is growing faster than anywhere else in the world, with a digitalization which is more rapid than anyone else. So this marketplace, as whether you're a B2B company for B2B customers or you're a consumer company for consumers, is just going to be the most exciting market in the world, right? And then if you go one layer further, kind of outside of Southeast Asia, and you look at the surrounding regions, what like India, 1.4 billion people, is now the most popular country in the world, and the fastest growing kind of large economy. China, on the real basis, is already the biggest economy in the world, leading within a lot of technologies. Like if you look at robotics, drones, this stuff, manufacturing, it's like clearly we're all leading, right? It's overtaken the US already. And I think it's one thing that the US really need to kind of look into, right? Because due to regulatory reasons, primarily, they lost out on the whole hardware robotics game so far. Japan, I was just in Japan the other day. We have a great office there. And the Japanese government has decided we want to be the biggest startup hub in the world. And we all know that when the Japanese decides to do something, they tend to be pretty serious about it. So, I think that you're going to see that space growing really, really fast. Korea, right, is like, they're winning in so many segments. They have the heavy industry companies, they're leading technology. And then you also have the entertainment business, the fashion, the skincare. Right, they built these global brands across so many different dimensions, right? So like that's the region we're in, and Singapore is in the middle of this whole thing. So it's like layer 1, build global business now in Singapore. Layer 2, the most exciting, fastest growing market in the world in Southeast Asia, surrounded by these giants that have tremendous amount of things to offer. So yeah, I'm very excited about the next decades here.
Yeah, they call this the Asian century. So hopefully we're right on that one, because then Singapore as a keynote connecting all these different economies.
Yeah,
I think there will be huge growth coming out of us and in the region as well.
sure.
I'm mindful of time, so we've got 2 wrap-up questions for you.
Yeah.
The first one is, do you have one book recommendation that you think everyone should read? Second one, advice to a fresh graduate.
The book I recommend to everyone is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Franklin. It's an incredible book. He was in the concentration camps, Auschwitz, during the war, and later he became a psychologist. And he talks about how when you are facing very difficult challenges, and obviously being in Auschwitz is probably one of the most horrible and worst challenge anyone could ever kind of go through in their entire life. What makes people kind of outperform? And obviously it's in this particular case, it's about survival, right? But in business and the world in general, if you're a young person, older person, whatever, his conclusion, it really comes down to having a purpose, having a meaning. And that could be anything, right? Like, obviously my meaning now at Antler is just like, we would just want to enable the world's best people to solve important problems and make progress inevitable. And I have a very clear meaning and purpose related to that. And for other people, it might be to be the best violinist in the world, or it might be to raise your children, or it might be to run the 100-meter faster than whatever it is. But like, meaning really drives progress, and I think just makes people much, much happier. I don't think if you have meaning in your life, then things gets pretty tough. So I really recommend reading that book.
And then the piece of advice that you give to a fresh graduate entering the workforce?
I have tons of advice, but like one I'd really recommend people to do is try to think very, very long term about something. Like try to think about whether it's 10 years or 15 years, 20 years. Like, I think 10 years is a good time frame. And think about something you would be very, very excited about achieving, like something really ambitious. And again, it doesn't need to be that you build the world's greatest business or you become the prime minister of Singapore. Like it doesn't need to be like that level, but it could be that, you have the most amazing husband or wife in the world and 3 kids and like whatever it might be, but like something really audacious that or you've visited 100 countries, like whatever it is, like, back to what I talked about earlier, like figure out what your meaning is. And then, and it should be really out there, right? Like it should be almost impossible to achieve. And it's like, I want to go to the moon, or I want to build the first $1 trillion company out of Singapore, or whatever it might be, like really audacious. And then think about how does that relate to what I'm going to do the next year? Right? What does that mean for what I want to do next year? And what does that mean in terms of what I want to do the next 3 months? And what does that mean in terms of what I want to do the next month? And what does that mean in terms of what I'm going to do the next week? So I think very often, and I think it's harder than ever today for particularly young people, because the optionality is so big. Optionality is big, and then you're constantly being bombarded by people living their dream through social media, whatever it is. So it's hard to make choices. And then if you don't make choices and decisions on your own life, then life is going to rule you, and you're not going to rule your own life. So like set that audacious place you want to go, figure out what your meaning is, and then kind of work on like what will get me a little bit closer over the next week, right? Like if you want to go to the moon, you're just not going to achieve it next week, right? So like, or if you want to build a $1 trillion company, or if you want to find a cure for cancer, you're just not going to do it in a week. But if you aim to do it in 10 years, there's a possibility you can do it. But then unless you do something over the next week, which is somewhat related to achieving that, you're never going to get there, because achieving something incredibly hard takes a lot of time. And you want to set the path for your own life, and not have life set the path for you.
Wow. With that, thank you, Magnus, for coming on
Thanks for having me.
today's episode. If you are watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications for whenever new episodes are out. If you're on Spotify or Apple, it would help us greatly if you could leave a 5-star review on those platforms. Once again, thank you for tuning in to the Front Row Podcast.